Let's go. What's up, y'all? Happy Sunday night. Big nine night. Let's make this a good one. What else better to talk about on the Big Nine than some Victorian English literature? So tonight we're covering much requested. By the way, this is much requested. A lot of ladies out there requested this. Have been requesting it for a while. A bunch of requests for this. So we decided to do some dark Victorian literature tonight. We're going to be talking about Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Let's see. We're going to be doing Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Jane Eyre. We'll be talking about Jean Rhys's WIDE SARGASSO SEA. This isn't Victorian literature. This is modern literature, but it is, if you didn't know this, this serves as a kind of a prequel to Bronte's Jane Eyre. And then I'll be talking a little bit. I'll be making reference to Wuthering Heights, but of course we're going to do Wuthering Heights probably as its own stream because it's too thick of a book. There's too much content, too much analysis to do with Wuthering Heights to try and fit it all into this stream. So, shouts out to everybody who's here. Happy Sunday night. We're rolling strong into September, y'all. Thank you, everybody who watched my Apocalypse Now stream with my homeboy last week. That was fun. And if you want to see a sponsored stream, if you want to sponsor a stream, please consider supporting me and dropping some fat Dugan coin, some fat Kong bucks, $100. Drop me $100 and I will do a stream. Of course, it has to be something we want to do here and that fits our content and that I think we should do. But give me some suggestions what you want to do and I will do it. I will spend some good time doing it. Speaking of which, I've been living with these books for the past couple days here, and I've also watched a bunch of films, a bunch of Victorian films, films about that relate to the content tonight. And listening to a bunch of, I've really been living this. So we're rolling strong here into fall. It's going to be, it's humid as heck outside right now. I don't know where y'all are, but here in Appalachian, it's pretty humid. It's been raining. Y'all see that rain? It came out of nowhere. But you can tell the times. Y'all tell that the times are already changing. Yeah, can you tell? Can you tell it's getting darker earlier? Man, I can't wait till those leaves change and it turns into fall. So that's why we are covering some dark Victorian literature set in the moors, various moors tonight, not just the Yorkshire moors or Northumberland, which is where Wuthering Heights is set. But this is more Thomas Hardy, Wessex country, and then we go back to Jane Eyre, where we get the Bronte country in the north of England. So yes, please consider supporting me with super chat. You guys, we're getting close to 1,000 here. So we're going to get that super chat function up soon. And also, just before I get started, a big week coming up this week, y'all. We've got, well, I was going to make it a surprise, but you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and announce it. We got birthday week this week. It's my birthday. It's also TGF, our homeboy, the Green Feathers, his birthday this week. And Church of the Eternal Logos, Cotel, Coteasy, DPH, David Patrick Harry, his birthday's this week. But we are having a birthday stream on Wednesday night where we're going to cover something cool. I've decided we're going to do it early. And we're going to cover Bram Stoker's Dracula, the book, and the Francis Ford Coppola film. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to go into some really dark, again, sort of dark, late Victorian Edwardian literature and film. And we'll also talk about a couple of other vampire films just as part of an add-on for the analysis. We're going to cover Only Lovers Left Alive, great Jim Jarmusch film. And what else are we going to cover? The Hunger, Tony Scott's The Hunger. And maybe even the film Byzantium. And so hopefully you've seen at least one of those. Probably you've seen 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula. But yeah, we're going to be covering that this week. And I'll also be doing Wuthering Heights. And so that's going to be fun. It's going to be a good, I thought that would be something good to do for fall and for my birthday coming up. So where should we start? I guess we'll start with, let's start with Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So this is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Thomas Hardy, late 19th century literature. It was published in 1891. Of course, Victorian era is 1837 to 1901, and that's pretty fitting that we see the end of the Victorian era, where we had the second longest reigning English monarch. Now we've got, I even found a note here. I find these sticky notes everywhere, and this one literally says, I don't know what this is from, but it says, up the wibble wobbles, welly boots and barber jacket. I forget which one we used for that, but so it's kind of fitting that we're covering Victorian literature tonight, I suppose. Did you know, by the way, that QE2 is not the longest reigning monarch? You know, it's actually Louis XIV, reigned for 2 years longer. I'm sure you knew that, but anyway. Cheers out there, chim chim. So, let's start with Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Thomas Hardy. I'm not the biggest Thomas Hardy fan, but that doesn't matter because we're not doing, hold on a second. We're not doing a book review, right? We're doing an analysis. And I just fed the dog, so now she's going to start barking. Hold on one second. Come here, baby. Come here. Come here. Come here. Come on. There you go. Come on. Yes, you stay right there. Okay, good girl. There you go. Okay, so, yes. So, this is a dark novel. It concerns someone named Tess. And she is the female protagonist of the novel. And basically, just to give you a quick plot, what happens is we get Tess is she's country folk. And her dad finds out that from the parson. That's right, Countess. Shouts out to Countess out there, by the way. Thank you for supporting me, Countess. Thank you to, I'll get to the shouts out in a minute. Tess, her dad is, he's a drunkard, and he's on the road, and he happens to run by the parson, who tells him that actually she's related to one of the landed gentry families, the D'Urbervilles. And that then she finds out that there's a house down the road. This is all in Hardy, Wessex country, which is generally Dorset, Devon, etc. That's why the characters have a sort of a West Country accent. Hardy writes in the vernacular of these characters, and there's a clear delineation in the class system within the text, and he writes in the vernacular of the particular characters. I couldn't help but find some weird correlations between the guy that she meets and never falls in love with, by the way, this guy Alec d'Urberville, and AC Al Crowley, because, and I thought that was interesting because it's sort of the part of the country, but more his temperament and how he acts, and also that Al Crowley was born around this time. Just it's not a purposeful correlation. Obviously Hardy would have no idea who Al Crowley is, but the Plymouth Brethren are actually mentioned in the book, in the text, and Alec, and I say there's a correlation between the two because, of course, Al Crowley was called Alec when he was young. Go back to our Aleister Crowley stream. He was called Alec by his mother, and then chose the name Aleister Crowley, right? Edward Alexander Crowley. But Alec D'Urberville, they go by Derbyfield, and then the noble house is D'Urberville. Is later on becomes a sort of a Methodist minister, but the Plymouth Brethren are specifically mentioned in the text. And one of the themes of the novel is, of course, the sort of paganism versus Christianity, and how the countryside and the people are identified. But anyway, so what happens with Tess is she is a country girl. Her dad finds out that that they are loosely related to these people. She goes up, she gets a job. She meets this guy, Alec d'Urberville, and she sort of pushes away his advances. And then she gets a job. Then one night she's hanging out in the local village with the local lowly townspeople, and they're coming back drunk from a village, a do, right, from the pub or whatever. she gets in somebody wants to fight her. This woman wants to fight her because she says, "You think you're better than us," right? And she's sort of rescued by Alec, who then puts her on horseback. She doesn't really want to go, but she's put on horseback. Then they wander into this place called the Chase. It's a moonlit sylvan scene, and of course, the local townspeople are supposed to be they resemble sort of nymphs and satyrs, and that's the figurative interpretation of the scene. And then they kind of have gotten lost in the moonlight. He lays her down. She falls asleep. He finds his way, then goes back to her, and then something happens. And so one of the things that that happens in this text is that what happens when the scene cuts. And you can assume that she is raped by Alec. Now, it's not specifically stated, but the language throughout I was specifically looking for the speaker in the texts later commenting on what happened. And the language, the question is whether she has this guilt that overrides her entire life in the rest of the text because of her loss of maidenhood. And is the guilt because she was raped or because somehow she gave in to this? The scene cuts, and what happens is she is pregnant, and then she has a child, and it's Alec's child. They're not married, and she knows that the baby's sick, and then she baptizes the baby herself. The baby dies. Baptizes the baby herself. The baby dies, is buried in the end of the cemetery with all of the what have you, and then she leaves. She continuously leaves her little locus, like to go into the wider world, but it's always, the wider world is always still within this sort of general country atmosphere. And then she gets a job as a dairy maid on a dairy farm, and meets this guy named Angel, right? And is he supposed to be her saving grace? Is he her avenging angel? Is he her guardian angel? But his name's Angel Clare. He falls in love with her, and he's also like higher up on the social strata. And what happens is we find out that he's essentially working in this place he's working there by choice, not by necessity. And that he wants to work there to be this dairy farm boy, so that he can learn the business in the Victorian mores. He can learn the business and then eventually run a business or a similar business like it. He really, he sort of courts her, and then she falls in love with him, but then she has this, secret that she wants to reveal to him, but she doesn't say it until after they get married. What happens is they get married, and then he reveals to her after they're married that he has not been chaste. They're young, but he has not been chaste, and that he has, experienced women before he met her. And then she's relieved by this, and she says, "Well, I have something to reveal to you." And she tells him what happened in the Sylvan scene, right, in the Artemis Diana, moonlit Sylvan scene. And his response is not at all what she thought. In fact, he's not disgusted by it, but he sees her as, there's a clear split. He sees her as a different person than the person that he knew. And so again, the question is like the interpretation of what exactly happened. But he sees her as kind of fouled. And they resume their relationship as best they can, but she right away pretty much says like, "Well, if you don't love me anymore, then you can divorce me." And he says, "There's no question of that. I can't do that." So what ends up happening is essentially, like, I'm just giving you kind of a short version of the plot here. He takes a job where he's going to work in the far colonies, and he decides to leave and go to Brazil. So he goes to the literal polar opposite side of the world from her, and he leaves her, and they're still married. And she returns home, now she's kind of a soiled woman. She's a broken woman because, and it's this secret in the town, because not only did this thing happen to her that sort of people know about like loosely and she could hear them talking, but now she's gotten married and then now her husband has left her. So long story short, like, well, I guess it's not a very short story, but time passes and, you know, she's living her life. And then one day she's walking back through a village and she sees another parson up there talking on a soapbox. He's preaching, and she thinks she knows the voice, and she looks and she's astounded to see that it's Alec, her old Alec. Not her old Alec, but, you know, the guy from the past, right? And he stops mid sermon. He's outside, you know, he's standing in the mud. The peasants are out there stacking mud and sort of listening to him. But he stops and he chases her down the street and he confronts her and he says, "Hey, there you are. You know, what are you doing? I can't, you know, I've changed my life and I'm so, you know, I'm living with my sins, and as bad as you feel, I feel much worse," which is, we don't know. Okay, we don't really know. But anyway, he says that he loves her. She's like, no, I don't love you. Get away from me. She don't want to see him anymore. And then he asks her out again or whatever. She says, "I can't go out with you, and it's not because of anything you said." She don't want to tell him that she's married because it's none of his business. And also now she has to get into a whole thing about what happened to Angel, right? So she tells him like what happened, right? And or not what happened, but she tells him about her husband, and he's like, "Well, where is he? I'll meet him." And she's like, "No, he's away. He's far away. He's gone away, man. He's gone away to be with his people, man." Apocalypse Now. He's gone away to be with his people. And he's like, "Well, what kind of husband is that? What a shit. Okay, you know, let's get married anyway." And she's like, "No, you don't understand. We can't. I'm still married, doucher, right?" And he won't take no for an answer. Then fast forward, what happens is basically she gets it into her head that he's never coming back again. You know, he's dead or he's never coming back again or whatever. And she gets married to him. And then Angel returns right then. And then she's like, "Oh my gosh." Then she goes back home and she sees Alec again. And by this time she's like living in D'Urberville Hall, you know, and she's like wearing expensive threads, and she's gone like up and down, right? Not really up and down the social ladder, but in terms of her life, her adventures, her certainly her feelings, and she's all about feelings. She's like, she's got money and she's got this husband, but she hates her husband. She hates Alec because he got it into her head that her real husband was never coming back. And then he reveals that, "Listen, I'm not even a D'Urberville. I'm a Stokes. We bought our name basically." Like, because Alec and Tess are cousins. He mentions in the book they're 31st cousins. But like, she's under the illusion that he, you know, has this hereditary title, and he's like, no, my dad or my granddad or whatever bought it because it was going extinct, and we're Stokes. And he was like what was he? He was a money changer. He was this guy's a usurer and a merchant, and he bought the title, right? So then she's like, "So I've been living a lie this whole time. Not only have I been living a lie," she says, in herself, but like she's been living a lie, like all these events, like what happened, is it truth versus illusion, and then he makes her mad, and then what happens is she all of a sudden runs back to Angel. This is the end of the book. She runs back to Angel and she says, "We're free now. I've killed him. She killed her husband. We don't see this occur. This is the Shakespearean, off stage, off camera, off narrative murder. But she has killed him. And you kind of wonder for a minute, like, did she really kill him? Is she lying? Is she saying that she's not the type to lie? She just lies by omission or hides things because of her, and that's fine. But because it's not their business. But at this point, she runs back. She says, "We're free." So he says, "All right, let's get out of here." and they take off to Wiltshire, and they take off to Salisbury Plain, and they end up at, of course, Stonehenge, where there's this famous Thomas Hardy scene of her lying down on one of the monoliths, right, at Stonehenge, like sort of sacrificing herself in this sort of quasi-pagan scene. She's sacrificing her life for her happiness and her liberation. And then right then, the bobbies show up. Oi, we've been looking for you. And she says, are they here? And the husband says, Tess, they're here. She basically gives herself up. And the next scene we see is we're looking at a hill, and instead of looking at her, or the book is voyeuristic in many ways, because the speaker is always describing the way that she looks, especially juxtaposed against the countryside. And the subtitle, The Pure Woman, right? She's this like innocent sort of nymph character, and saved by this angel of mercy, but she sacrifices herself at this pagan scene. And then the last scene we see is, instead of her up on the hillside, we see basically a wooden, we see a black flag rise, signifying that she has been hanged, right? She's been executed. Hanged, remember, it's hanged, not hung. Objects are hung, people are hanged. And she's dead, and that's the end of the book. So that is essentially the plot. But the question is, what does it all mean? What are some of the motifs and themes in this? And I'm going to take a different viewpoint than the usual. I don't know what you would call it. I would usually call this a normie analysis. Obviously, when people are looking at Victorian literature, especially literature written by women or about women, they will take the theme of, the oppression of the patriarchy. And I'm going to take a different viewpoint than that. I think that, the question is this, I really, as I said earlier, lived with this book for a while, but, reading, especially, of course, who do we go back to when we're looking into, literature? When you read, Harold Bloom and his analysis of Thomas Hardy, and various other scholars. One thing is that, and Bloom says this, is that Hardy is not a believer. Those are Bloom's words. He's not a believer. And I've always considered Hardy, I've always stayed away from Thomas Hardy for this reason. Now that his writing, and especially his pastoral scenes of, idyllic tranquility, are quite beautiful, right? And his language is immense and terrifying in a way. I mean, he specifically talks about the idea of negative beauty. And so what we have is, again, this juxtaposition between free will and fate, and religious symbolism, and sort of the weird sort of pagan idolatry of the self in the book. And I think that Tess, one of the issues in the book is, obviously, the driving force in the narrative is the trauma that happens to her in the woods. It's not specifically stated, but I think one crazy thing in the book is that it becomes mixed, where it doesn't really matter what happened to her in terms of what the speaker is writing. I'm not saying I believe that, but I think that obviously, there is this sense of oppression in the book. However, one can't get over the fact that Tess is a kind of a negative angel, in the sense that she is not looking for deliverance. She's not looking for any metaphysical deliverance, certainly. And if she is, it's buried deep down inside of her. The language is metaphysical at times, but she is certainly, she pushes away all advances to her and any sort of semblance of love. And I'm not just talking about from Alec. I'm talking about from Angel, who has this kind of pure love for her. But the problem is, and this is what Hardy calls the ache of modernism. The fact is that there is this lurking darkness in the book, and that is signified, especially later in the book, by the mechanization of the countryside. So it's like the people are being spoiled or their will or their spirit is being spoiled, desanctified by this sort of satanic mechanization that creeps into the countryside. And I say that because the language is specifically that of evil. I mean, this is like the Blakean dark satanic mills of his poem Jerusalem, right? Where we have this side by side, or rather within it, it's almost like a germ. It's almost like mechanization creeps into the pastoral, and it's reaping machines, but it like sort of reaps the souls of the people because there's no way out. They think they're going to be delivered by modernity, or at least one would think that they're going to be delivered by modernity and have a better life, but there's the social mobility remains the same or even worse. Nobody sort of escapes it. The only person who escapes their negative social state is Alec, right? And even he is. It's kind of inverted because he almost goes lower than he does higher, because, and Hardy is a staunch critic of Victorian morals, but that being said, he doesn't really offer any kind of it's just simply naturalistic. It's like fatalistic, naturalistic, and one event leads to another. In fact, the beginning of the book talks about how this chance meeting between this parson and this man leads like a domino effect to further events. But I don't see that. I mean, looking at it from the outside, outside of the narrative, that's not what occurs at all. She has free will and she makes choices just like everybody else does in the book, and their choices affect each other. But let me read you one of the passages about the satanic mechanization. This is on page 261, chapter 47 in the book. It says, in the threshing of the last wheat rick at Flintcomb Ash Farm, Flint Ash Farm. It's automatically, we see this as kind of an Elliott wasteland or a Valley of Ashes, like later in the modern era with Gatsby. Remember, we did our Gatsby Jeff Sinefre stream. The dawn of the March morning is singularly impressive, and there's nothing to show where the eastern horizon lies. There is nothing to show where the eastern horizon lies. There's nothing rising in the east, right? You're rising in the east, right? But there's nothingness there, he says. Against the twilight rises the trapezoidal top of the stack, which has stood forlornly here through the washing and bleaching of the wintry weather. Farmer Groby, having insisted upon their being on the spot thus early to get the job over, if possible, by the end of the day, close under the eaves of the stack and as yet barely visible was the red tyrant that the women had come to serve, a timber-framed construction with straps and wheels appertaining the threshing machine, which, whilst it was going, kept up a despotic demand under the endurance of their muscles and nerves. A little way off, there was another indistinct figure, this one black with a sustained hiss that spoke of strength, very much in reserve, the long chimney running up beside an ash tree, and the warmth which radiated from the spot explained without the necessity of much daylight that here was the engine which was to act as the primum mobile of the little world. By the engine stood a dark, motionless being, a sooty and grimy embodiment of tallness, in a sort of trance with a heap of coals by his side. It was the engine man, right? You see this guy's like a Vulcan. He's like a Vulcan figure under the volcano. The isolation of his manner and color lent him the appearance of a creature from Tophet who had strayed into the pellucid smokelessness of this region of yellow grain and pale soil with which he had nothing in common to amaze and to discompose its aborigines. Sorry, sometimes I have trouble reading it because of my own. I write over the text. What he looked, he felt. He was in the agricultural world, but not of it. He served fire and smoke. These denizens of the fields served vegetation, weather, frost, and sun. He traveled with his engine from farm to farm, from county to county. For as yet, the steam threshing machine was itinerant in this part of Wessex. He spoke in a strange northern accent, his thoughts being turned inwards upon himself, his eye on his iron charge, hardly perceiving the scenes around him and caring for them not at all. holding only strictly necessary intercourse with the natives, as if some ancient doom compelled him to wander here against his will in the service of his plutonic master. Hello? The long strap which ran from the driving wheel of his engine to the red thresher under the rick was the sole tie line between agriculture and him. When they uncovered the sheaves, he stood apathetic beside his portable repository of force, round whose hot blackness the morning air quivered. He had nothing to do with preparatory labor. His fire was waiting, incandescent. His steam was at high pressure. In a few seconds, he could make the long strap move at an invisible velocity. In other words, do you see? Do you see what I'm saying? And it's interesting because that's one of the motifs that I found to compare. I found a lot of comparisons. See, look, this book, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, actually can be compared in many ways to Jane Eyre and to Wide Sargasso Sea. In fact, I found more comparison. I found there's an outright comparison between Wide Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre because it's the prequel to the book. But in terms of the theme and in terms of the symbolism and the meaning and the looking at the meaning of their life in their time and this ache of modernism, and what it means to love and to find beauty in the world. I found way more ties between Wide Sargasso Sea and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. In fact, I can't help but think that Jean Rhys really was writing about Tess when she was using Jane Eyre as the impetus for her novel, if that makes sense. Because one of the things is the ties that bind, right? So one of the themes is that we have this demarcation between ancestral ties and what it means to be tied to the land and tied by blood, right? Especially in terms of English nobility, and the ties with the people that you actually love, and what separates you, and what severs the tether. And there's a scene in Jane Eyre where Rochester talks to Jane Eyre, and he's saying basically like, okay, I got you a job, and we'll get back to Jane Eyre in a second, but I got you this job, and you're going to be the governess of a house in Ireland. You're going to move to Ireland. And she's like, oh, no, I'm upset. And he's like, why are you upset? Tell me, is it, and he's trying to say, is it because like, you love me? And she like doesn't want to say this because she doesn't want to seem too forward, but she's saying, she simply says, oh no, you're going to marry this other girl. And then finally, he says, it's not her that I want to marry, it's you. Duh. But before that, he says, look, I feel like there's a secret invisible tie, like a string that goes from, and he says, from my heart right here, like by his waistcoat, to your heart. And he doesn't touch her, but he says, it's by her breast, right? And no matter where we go, I can be in England, you can be in Ireland, but we'll still be we'll have this psychic connection. And in fact, that does occur in Jane Eyre. There is a kind of a psychic connection that occurs towards the end of the book. It also, of course, occurs in Wuthering Heights. But in this, we see that the psychic connection or the tie is completely severed between Tess and her and the person who wants to have ties with her, which is Angel, and of course, Alec. And the only tie that occurs is the people are tied to the land, but they are tied down, right? They are bound to the land. They're not free. They think that they're free. And we see Tess as like wanting to be free, but she keeps venturing further and further out in terms of the atmosphere, right? And in terms of the ambiance. And she goes, she comes back. She goes, she comes back. She goes, she comes back. Like 3 separate times. And so the only tie that occurs is when this satanic, impish figure, who's the representative of, the representative or the minion of the managerial class of the oncoming democratization and modernization of the 20th century, makes his way into the countryside and starts sending out his little spider webs of ties to control these people through his mechanization, through his machine. there's an aspect of the allegorical journey throughout the book, throughout Jane Eyre, and the question is like, is this sort of Dantean, right? Because she keeps going in sort of circles. Her life figuratively goes in circles. She always comes back to where she started, but she literally goes back to where she started continuously. That's why she ends up back with Alec. That's why she sees. That's why she sees Angel. You see also one of the like brilliant little things about the language also is just the names, right? That we have two sort of Adam characters. That's why the stream is called Dark Virago, because Virago is the name in the Vulgate that Adam gave to Eve, right? And vir is Latin for man, right? Like your virility. Arma virum quae cana, right? I sing of arms and the man. But a Virago is like a strong Amazonian feminine figure. And she like continuously wants to be on her own. She wants to like live the life of a woman in the fullness of her will, but she's continuously thwarted. And the question is she thwarted by outside events and by what normies will always, term the patriarchy? And that may be the case, especially in the Victorian era, especially, right? But by her own sense of like not knowing who she is and what she wants and anything higher. Now she obviously does have spirit, right? She has this, and she's also thwarted by the kind of Alec, the false prophet. I mean, remember that when when her child dies, there's this horrid scene of where she knows that she can't take the child to the parson, the preacher, or at least she feels like she can't, and she sort of does this like false like sort of self baptism, and then by the time she tells the preacher about it, it's too late. But it's a horribly depressing scene because it kind of shows Hardy's worldview in the sense that that you're a plaything of fate, right? You are like King Lear. We are but playthings to the gods, right? They kill us for their sport. And another theme throughout this is that there are continuous references in the allegorical sense to King Lear, because there's a lot of walking. There's a lot, like Jane Eyre is always out walking. I watched this movie today called The Hidden Woman, about it's a Ray Fiennes movie. It's about Charles Dickens. Did you know Charles Dickens had a mistress? He was separated from his wife, and he lived with his partner, his life partner, his mistress, for like the last 18 years of his life. He was also an opium addict, if you didn't know that. But he lived with her, and she's continuously like walking. She's walking on the beaches, and the same of Tess. She's always walking. The main character in this, the protagonist, is always walking, but this is inverted because it's on the other side of the world. It's in the Windward Isles, and so we'll get to that next. But she's always walking in this sort of Dantean circle, and it always takes her right back to where she was. She wants to escape, but she always goes back. Let's see. Just another couple excerpts. References to the devil and to nymphs and satyrs and paganism are replete in this book. Let's see. But also the language of the desire or the wish for purity within the scene or within their life underrides the entire narrative. So there's this one part on page 14 at the beginning of the book when one of the only books that she has is a copy of The Complete Fortune Teller. The Complete Fortune Teller was an old thick volume, and then later it says, a sort of halo, an accidental glow came over life then. Troubles and other realities took on themselves a metaphysical impalpability, sinking to mere mental phenomena for serene contemplation, and no longer stood as pressing concrete concretions. I can't read it because I wrote over it. Concretions which chafe body and soul. A curious fetishistic fear of this grimy volume on the part of her mother prevented her ever allowing it to stay in the house all night, and hither it was brought back whenever it had been consulted. Between the mother, with her fast perishing lumber of superstitions, folklore, dialect, and orally transmitted ballads, and the daughter, with her trained national teachings and standard knowledge under an infinitely revised code, there was a gap of 200 years as ordinarily understood. When they were juxtaposed, the Jacobean and Victorian ages were juxtaposed. So that talks about, there's another scene where it's in the book where it talks about like the medieval simplicity of life versus the complications of the present day. And one could see that again in light of the ache of modernism, but the characters certainly make it so. One thing I considered when reading these books is the strange swiftness of the changing of the times and the epochs and the era. I mean, Wuthering Heights, I'll just say this about Wuthering Heights before I do my own stream on it. Wuthering Heights is interesting because the narrative takes place. Okay, so the book was published in 1847. Which is interesting because Jane Eyre was also published in 1847. Both sisters published their major works in the same year, and this is like a year before Emily Bronte died, and then it was revised and reprinted in 1850 under Charlotte Bronte's guidance. But what happened was the book was published in 1847. It was written earlier than that. The narrative takes place in 1801, but it goes back in time to the mid to late 1700s and then fast forwards in time, but still back in time to like 1798. So around 1798. Now, that's interesting because we have three definitely British or artistic eras in that short span of time. The book, the earliest age in Wuthering Heights is fully within the Enlightenment, right? It's fully within the Illuminate, Confirm, Enlightenment, and sort of takes on those values. And then we have 1798 to 1837, we have the Romantic era, and the book is certainly Byronic. I mean, one thing about these books is that, especially with Bronte, is the dark Byronic hero, and we have that in Rochester in Jane Eyre, and of course in Heathcliff, who's like the proto, Byronic hero, or proto-Byronic figure rather. In the book, he's the dark hero. He's the anti-hero, right? He's a sort of a satanic figure, and that'll come into play when we question whether that's true. Why did Heathcliff become this figure, right? But then we have 1837 full into the Victorian era in the 1840s. Now, Hardy is writing in 1891, right, when we're getting close to the end of the Victorian era into the Edwardian era. Or rather, we're getting into the Edwardian era, which is the start of the modernist era. So we have this like quick succession of times and epochs, and that may not sound like it means much, but when we consider that, more things changed in society from 1901 to, let's say, 1969, right, where we had people walking, and on horseback, going into 1969, where we had people on a soundstage bouncing on the moon with golf clubs and and dune buggies, right? We have a huge monumental change. I mean, I've mentioned this before, how, the tallest man-made structures for like that, 3,000 years were the Great Pyramid at Giza, with the pyramids in Egypt. But that is not to say that the late 1700s into the 1900s didn't have just as much change. It wasn't visible. It wasn't as visible, but it was certainly change in terms of outward. It wasn't really upward, but it was outward, right? Especially in terms of colonization in the 1800s. So now I guess I will shift. There's a bunch I could cite from Tess. There's a bunch of brilliant passages. Let me find this one other one. Let's see. There's one other one that I wanted to read, and that is Oh yeah, this was a weird passage. This is page 251 in again in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. This is my last part about this book. They were built by Grace. Cross. No, 'twere not a cross. 'Tis a thing of ill omen, miss. It was put up in wold times by the relations of a malefactor who was tortured there by nailing his hand to a post and afterwards hung. This is a common guy speaking. The bones lie underneath. They say he sold his soul to the devil and that he walks at times. She felt the petit mort at this unexpectedly gruesome information and left the solitary man behind her. All right, so that may seem like a, nothing passage if you don't know the context or if you're not looking at the words, but I find it interesting here that Hardy uses the term petit mot to describe the feeling that she gets from death. It's also foreshadowing her own later, her own fate or her own end, right? And her being hanged at the spot. It also ties in specifically with Wide Sargasso Sea and with Jane Eyre, because there are a number of times where characters will come to a crossroads and they will discuss, they will specifically mention selling their souls to the devil, and the characters are all in on it. They're not even saying it as a joke. In fact, Rochester, who is in both books, says this specifically. And so what I think is interesting here is that petit mot, right, of course, is the French term for the big O, right? The sexual O. And why does she have this association between sex and death that occurs at the moment where the crossroads join, where they're configured, and then they split? I think that's interesting and may say something about her character. And then, of course, on the previous page, at length, the road touched the spot called Cross in Hand of all spots on the bleached and desolate upland. This was the most forlorn. It was far removed from the charm which is sought in landscape by artists and view lovers as to reach a new kind of beauty, a negative beauty of magic tone. Interesting, right? Because later on, she feels a kind of magic in her own apotheosis, her own negative apotheosis in her negative beauty. And this ties in with, again, what Yeats called a terrible beauty, and also ties in with the Second Coming. I mean, there's a lot of echoes in the Second Coming of all of these books, as Yeats is writing, at the tail end of his own era, right? Yeats was born in 1865, and he's writing the Second Coming, his Golden Dawn Second Coming, about how the Victorian era has transfigured and apotheosized into the modern era, right? And okay, so now let's go to Wide Sargasso Sea. Hold on, I got a super chat real quick I'm going to take care of here. Thank y'all for being here tonight. I really appreciate you. Of course, all my homeboys out there and homegirls. We got a super chat here. We got $5 from Alan McIntyre. Thank you so much for supporting me, Alan. Really appreciate you always supporting me. Also, shouts out to Jen, Countess Powers, who sent me $15. Really appreciate you. Thank you to Joseph Wagner, who sent me $10 the other day. Really appreciate you. Thank you for that super chat. Shouts out to, in the last stream, shouts out to Nick Brady, TGF, the Green Feathers, who sent me $5. Sent me $10. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. We also had, we had a super chat from Andrew Martin. Big shouts out to Andrew Martin, who sent me $40 earlier this week. Thank you so much, homeboy. Really appreciate you. You guys, thank you so much for supporting me. You have no idea how much. Well, you do have an idea how much that means to me, because you're working. You're making your hard-earned Kong bucks, and you are supporting me with that, and I really appreciate you, because it is hard to make a buck out there. Shouts out $5 to Jonathan Burgess. Jonathan Burgess, who sent me $5 earlier and said, wish I could send you more, all the best. That was in the last stream. I don't know if I got to that one last time. So thank you so much. And if you want to support me, please make sure you look at those links, and because those fat stacks really mean a lot to me, y'all. Hopefully this mic is good. My homeboy gave me this mic for our Apocalypse Now stream, and y'all, we got some big upgrades coming. And I'm not just saying they're coming. I think, well, I don't know, but I think we're going to see some big changes this week, hopefully. And that is thanks to y'all's support out there. So thank you so much. Okay, next, let's get to Jean Rhys's WIDE SARGASSO SEA. You may not have heard of this book. I actually found this book because it was it was a movie on HBO or Skinemax back in the early 90s, starring Karina Lombard. And it's a sultry, sexy movie that really does not have that much to do with the book. But then again, I saw it in 2000 at the Queen's University bookstore in Belfast. I saw they had like Norton put out these like little pocket editions of novellas, and that was the one that I picked up. And then I read it again, and I just got this new copy. Yep, you guys are supporting me by helping me to buy books. And books are expensive, y'all. I mean, you know that. Everybody out there reads, I'm sure. Or if you don't, I'm sure you know that books are expensive. They're way more expensive now than they were even a couple years ago. Everything's gone up. But WIDE SARGASSO SEA is a prequel to Jane Eyre. And what I mean by that is that Jane Eyre is obviously about this guy, Edmund Rochester, who is landed gentry, but he's got a mad woman in the attic, okay? And we find that out in the book. And WIDE SARGASSO SEA is basically about how that came to be. And it takes a pretty purely modern look at and changes the series of events to place the blame not just on Rochester. Well, he's the reason that she got back to England and went mad, and the reason that she's obsessed with fire. She's a pyro arsonist in Jane Eyre, and we get the backstory in Jean Rhys's interpretation of the novel about why that is. And it's pretty interesting because Jean Rhys was raised in Martinique or Guadeloupe, one of those, but she's a product of the Anglo-European colonization, and she's a Creole, right? She is a European who's living abroad in the Caribbean, and she writes the book sort of from that perspective. It was published in the early 60s, and it's pretty short. I mean, it's a novella, but what happens is that there is a character named Antoinette, and Antoinette, of course, is called Bertha by Rochester, and he calls her that in Jane Eyre, but that's not her name. He makes up that name for her, and that's one of the issues in the book, is the idea of removing agency by making, giving her a name that's not her own. Countess says, aren't attics satanic or symbolize something? Well, there certainly is the Red Room, which is pretty clearly satanic because of what happens in it and in terms of like what it leads to, right? The Red Room is the punishment room that occurs in Jane Eyre. Also, Jess says that attic in Hereditary. Yeah, that's true. And also, remember that it's not just the attic, but it's the mother's room in Hereditary. I mean, she's got the sigils on the floor. She's got that triangle facing westward because, what's the name of the demon in Hereditary? Paimon is the one of the spirits of the air, right? And it's facing westward. And it's like at a strange angle in the room because that's where she's doing her rituals. Anyway, what happens in this is we get Antoinette as a child, and she represents the kind of loss of power or agency in terms of the colonists because the big S word has ended. Remember that there was the Emancipation Act in England was in like 1833, and so what happened was, as it describes it in the book, is that it ended, and then the family. All these people are sort of destitute in a way because there's nothing to replace it. There's no jobs. And the people who had the power like don't have the power anymore, as it's described in the book. And so now they're like on the same level, and the locals, because the book is set in Jamaica, the locals treat the WHITE people as lower. Okay, and so what happens is Antoinette is a child, and she's sort of living this, in a sense, like from her point of view, this like idyllic childhood where, they're in Jamaica and it's plush and it's tropical and beautiful, and the colors are amazing, like bright azures and verdant greens, and you can drop a seed in the ground the next day, you get the cucumber, you get the trees but what happens is her dad is like, no, everything's going to be all right. And then one night they find that the house is on fire, and the locals have come and they have burned down the house, and they have to escape. And her little baby brother, who's in his crib, he dies. And then there's a horrifying scene where the dad has clipped the wings of this parrot, and the parrot is trapped and is like screaming out, is screaming and on fire. And it's interesting that is what scares. That's an omen, because it scares away the locals. Because it's bad luck to kill a parrot, and they see the parrot on fire and dying, and they run away. They don't care about the child. They only care about the parrot, because they're in this sort of voodoo Santeria world. And we find out that Antoinette's nursemaid is also a witch, and she basically she's traumatized by fire, and she lives at a convent. She's educated by nuns, and then fast forward a few years, and we get this Englishman who shows up, and the Englishman he's straight from the system. He is from the English boarding schools, the English public schools. He's there in the far-flung reaches of the empire to run the empire, and she's essentially sold off by her dad to him. But what happens is, in Jane Eyre, what he says I got to skip to Jane Eyre for a second. Rochester reveals that he didn't know that she was mad because the father sort of kept him away from her, and he didn't. So he married her, but before that they were sort of kept apart. They were never had conversations together, right? And then he finds out that she's crazy, and that her mother was crazy and her grandmother was crazy, and then he brings her back to England and takes care of her and has a nurse, and she lives in the attic, but she's still mad as she tries to set the house on fire. But in this book, Wide Sargasso Sea, what we see is that, first of all, we get the reason for her insanity. Her mind has been split because she watched her brother, she's a child, and she watched her brother die, and then she watched the house set on fire, and she's continuously abused by the locals. And we don't get a sense that she's away from him. She's continuously trying to reach out to him and to talk to him and know him. But he has no emotion. He's a psychopath. He doesn't care about her, and then he steals her away to England. And in the book it says, there's a scene where it says, if I was bound for hell, let it be hell. This is page 154. If I was bound for hell, let it be hell. No more false heavens, no more damn magic. You hate me and I hate you. We'll see who hates best. But first I will destroy your hatred. Now, my hate is colder, stronger, and you'll have no hate to warm yourself. You will have nothing. I did it too. I saw the hate go out of her eyes. I forced it out, and with the hate of her beauty, she was only a ghost in the gray daylight, nothing left but hopelessness. Say die, and I will die. Say die, and watch me die. She lifted her eyes, blank, lovely eyes, a mad girl. So, that, it makes sense, actually, because one may criticize this as sort of, I don't know, cheap in a way, because one could say, a critic of the book, one might say, this is giving kind of a cheap backstory to Rochester, right? and like who he is. But it makes sense in light of Jane Eyre, because after all, he is the dark. Now, Jane Eyre ends on a positive note, right? And we'll get to that. But it's certainly different from, it's the exact opposite of Wuthering Heights. It's also pretty much the opposite of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it's also the opposite of this book. We see that this book is leading on to further events where she's going to go to cold, dreary England. But my notes about this were that, let's see, on page 17 of the book, we get this Edenic childhood where it says, the book is also split into threes. Tess of the D'Urberville is split into 7 phases. This book is split into 3 with two sets of, we have 2 narrators. We have the speaker in the first part is Antoinette, and then when we get Rochester, he takes over the bulk of the narrative because, of course, he dominates her life and her oncoming life, right? But in this part, she's the speaker, and it says, "Our garden was large and beautiful as the garden in the Bible. The tree of life grew there, but it had gone wild. The paths were overgrown, and a smell of dead flowers mixed with the fresh living smell. Underneath the tree ferns, tall as forest tree ferns, the light was green. Orchids flourished out of reach, or for some reason not to be touched. One was snaky looking, another like an octopus with long, thin brown tentacles, bare of leaves, hanging from a twisted root. Twice a year the octopus orchid flowered. Then not an inch of tentacle showed. It was a bell-shaped mass of white, mauve, deep purples, wonderful to see. The scent was very sweet and strong. I never went near it." So we have this Edenic scene complete with the serpent entering, and the serpent is supposed to foreshadow Rochester entering the scene. The serpent is also identified with a phallic image, and the seasonal changes of motherhood and birth and death. And it's also interesting that the octopus, I think the octopus in this scene symbolizes the fact that the specter-like tentacles of the power structure from which he arises reaches all the way into the far-flung colonies and even into her life, where he's going to control her. At one point, he says, let's see, he talks about his own, there's the psychopathic scene. Let's see if I can find this. Colors and duality play a role in this book also, especially references to, I think unintentional references to Rimbaud's Vowels, his poem Vowels. But on page 50 it says, "Then there was another saint, said Mother Justine. She lived later on, but still in Italy, or was in Spain. Italy is white pillars and green water. Spain is hot sun on stones. France is a lady with black hair wearing a white dress because Louise was born in France 15 years ago, and my mother, whom I must forget and pray for us as though she were dead, though she is living, liked to dress in white," which is of course, the innocence of her mother in her memory or in her psyche. She says, "Let perpetual light shine on them. Everything was brightness or dark. The walls, the blazing color of the flowers in the garden. The nuns' habits were bright, but their veils, the crucifix hanging from their waists, the shadows of the trees were black. That was how it was, light and dark, sun and shadow, heaven and hell. For one of the nuns knew all about hell, and who does not? But another one knew about heaven and the attributes of the blessed, of which the least is transcendent beauty, the very least. I could hardly wait for all this ecstasy, and once I prayed for a long time to be dead. Then remembered that this was a sin, its presumption or despair, I forget which, but a mortal sin. So I prayed for a long time about that too. But the thought came, so many things are sins. Why? Another sin to think not. However, happily, Sister Marie Augustine says thoughts are not sins if they are driven away at once. You say, Lord, save me, I perish. I find it very comforting to know exactly what must be done. All the same, I did not pray so often after that, and soon hardly at all. I felt bolder, happier, more free, but not so safe." And this is the duality of colors in the stream, obviously represent the fact that she goes from this pure Edenic scene with the tree of life, which is burned, right? Everything is burned. And the colors represent duality. Everything is this or that, light or dark, right? Heaven or hell. and she is sort of moved into this sort of Gnostic spirituality mixed with the zombie references and the Santeria that is the covert influence on her life from her nanny, right? From her nurse, who is an actual witch. And we see that again, manifests itself with the end of the novel, where she is bound for the cold dreariness of England, which is the polar opposite. She should be in paradise, right? In an earthly paradise. Rochester, when he gets there, brings his coldness. He says at one point that he was taught at the age of 5 to hide his emotions and hide anything that might give it away, right? That might give himself away. Because this is, of course, the sort of psychopathic system that is bred into the rulers of the empire, who are not supposed to show any emotion or favor to those that they rule, so that they can report back to the top of the pyramid, right? And that makes its way into his personal relationships, even with this woman, who, again, is one of him, but she's different because she's from the other side of the world. This is like a hell to his heaven, and his heaven is a hell in the Byronic Miltonian sense, right? It's also interesting that the correlation between what happens here and what happens with Angel and Tess, because Angel does almost the exact same thing. Now, he goes to Brazil, he doesn't go to Jamaica, but it's still the same in the sense that it's the other side of the world. It's the kind of plutonic other side of the world that was described in the Ache of Modernism passage, the oncoming hellscape of modernity. Let's see, what else? So, on page 63, I'll read one more passage from this book. I wrote, everything is too much blue, too much purple, too much green. The vibrancy of the new world is too much for his comprehension. There's a kind of a chaos of synesthesia. We also get the sense that we get a strong sense that of Ordo ab Caio on his part, on Rochester's part. I mean, he mentions Jamaica specifically and going to tend to the far reaches of the empire in Jane Eyre. But on this page, it says, the road climbed upward on one side the wall of green, on the other a steep drop to the ravine below. We pulled up and looked at the hills, the mountains, and the blue-green sea. There was a soft, warm wind blowing, but I understood why the porter had called it a wild place. Not only wild, but menacing. Those hills would close in on you. This is kind of the opposite of what happens in Tess, where nature is seen as unspoiled and idyllic. Here it's seen as wild and needing to be conquered. What an extreme green was all I could say, and thinking of Emile calling to the fisherman and the sound of his voice, I asked about him. They take shortcuts. They will be at Grambois long before we are. Everything is too much. I felt as I rode wearily after her. Too much blue, too much purple, too much green. The flowers too red, the mountains too high, the hills too near, and the woman is a stranger. It's interesting they talk about the stranger, because I just watched this this series that really blew me away. I was pretty impressed, actually, called The Outsider. The stranger, remember, Camus' stranger, L'Étranger, is the outsider. Rimbaud also says, I is another. And we get the idea of the other. And in The Stranger, we have some of these same themes. I mean, this is intertextuality and how these themes like continuously pop up, right? In things that you wouldn't think. And yeah, again, on page 151, save me from destruction, ruin, and desolation. And that's exactly what they both get in this book. So, moving on finally to Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre's an interesting book. It's my favorite of these three books. I actually, like Jane Eyre. For one, it ends on a positive note. It's a happy ending. And we see pretty Victorian ideals of mobilization and society, and almost the Deus Ex Machina in the book, how Jane Eyre is saved from her monetary ruin by the unlikely meeting of a relative who then leaves her a fortune. The same thing occurs in the Dickensian world, right? With Great Expectations. This is one of the common motifs in Victorian literature. And what that's to say is that what that kind of says in a kind of a it's not quite insidious, but what it's really saying about the Victorian world is that the society structures are meant to be that way, because even if you are, it's kind of the opposite of the so-called American dream, where it's like, oh, you go out, you go west, young man, and you can work for what you get and you can rise and anybody can be president and all that shit. But in the Victorian English world, the sense is that even if you are of low standing, you can meet somebody who will save you, right? And they will save you from being one of the people that you came from, right? This occurs with Jane Eyre. And now love is mixed in with this, and there is a reality to it in a sense, right? Because this occurs in the world. But Andrew says the landscape of literature is so telling of human emotion. Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting that the Bronte sisters, especially, that we have these three sisters who are writing in the moors, right, and the desolation and the emptiness within the empire, within England. And that's one of the themes that occurs especially at the beginning of Wuthering Heights, because what's his name? Lockwood, the character who comes at the beginning of the book, when he's talking to Heathcliff, he says, like, how can you stand it out here? I mean, on the one hand, you have your family around you, but on the other hand, like, it's completely desolate. You're surrounded by bogs and marsh, and that is obviously supposed to be an outer symbol of their interior life. But it's important that the characters have an inner strength that is derived from their religious faith. And oftentimes what goes wrong in these books is the sense that when the bad things happen, they immediately turn and they blame God, they blame God, and they don't think about their own will, their own agency. And it's interesting that they always use metaphysical language to talk about their atheism. I think that's one of my criticisms. However, that is not only probable, but seems to be pretty common. And so, just to cover Jane Eyre, what happens in Jane Eyre, just a brief plot, is that we have this little girl who is like the typical Victorian protagonist, in that she is like Pip in Great Expectations. She's like it's the same in, Oliver Twist or any of these books where we have a child who is an orphan. Same thing occurs in Wuthering Heights. A child who is an orphan and is sort of sold to this school where she is presided over and abused by Mr. Throcklehurst. Right, Mr. Throcklehurst. These people don't know anything. They come in here and they rub their mud and their boots all over the floors. You're trying to talk up there. Tell them, Mr. Throcklehurst. Right. And you silly little child. Right. Right on your blackboard. Learn your Latin. Right. And they're just horrid characters. And anyway, she's educated, and then she's like a plain Jane. She's the plain Jane. Right. She, especially in all the film versions of Jane Eyre. I mean, I've seen the Cary Joji Fukunaga version of Jane Eyre, which is pretty good. It's got Michael Fassbender and Mia Wasikowska, or whatever her name is. Mia Wasikowska? I don't know. Anyway, and that's a pretty good version. And then I also watched the Samantha Morton version with Ciarán Hinds. Ciarán Hinds from Queen's University Belfast. Good old Ciarán Hinds, who actually is a much better Rochester than Michael Fassbender is. And he's more of he's a dark character. He's Byronic. He has much more of a darkness about him, which is then redeemed in the latter parts of the book. Also, there's the Ruth Wilson version. There's a version of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I'm not going to watch because it involves, what's her name? I won't say anything about the main character in that, but it's called Tess, but it's directed by Roman Polanski, and I haven't seen it. I don't really plan on watching it because I just have the feeling it's going to be a creeper version. And anyway, so what happens is Jane goes to be a governess, right? She goes to this, is it Thornfield Hall? She goes to Thornfield Hall, right? It's pretty obvious. She goes to the dark and dreary moors to Thornfield Hall, where Rochester is he's the master of the house, but he's not there. But she's gonna go and teach the kids, right? And then she comes across Rochester because he's like riding through the moors and he has like an accident with his horse and hurts his leg. He kind of brushes her off with his stick or whatever. And then later on, she gets back to the house and they're like, hurry up, where have you been? Where have you been? Master's here, the master of the house is here. Right? And then she's like, she sees the dogs, because he has these dogs, he has these hounds, the hound of the Baskervilles, right? He's got these wild moorland, Irish wolfhounds or whatever, the hounds of love, the Kate Bush hounds of love. She recognizes the dog. She goes in and he tells her, sit down. And she's like, why do you have such a gruff manner, And he's like, well, it wouldn't hurt to wear a little rouge now and again, right? That's not what he says, but that's what you get watching the movie. And in the books, they just, the film versions of the book, I got to say, are pretty faithful. But what happens is, he's like, look, forgive me if I'm gruff, but I'm like, I'm this, I'm kind of a big deal, and I'm used to, telling everybody to do things, and they just do it. They just get it done. Well, he has a party. She meets the lovely ladies, and somehow she's still allowed in the party, even though she's this lowly governess, this plain Jane. She thinks that he's in love with this one woman. I don't remember what her name is, Pippa or some shit, But anyway, he's actually in love with her. Now, there's a red room that she was sentenced to when she was growing up, where she was picked on by the other kids. This must have happened to the Brontes because they all talk about this. They were picked on by the other kids, and then they're blamed for the trouble, and then they're put in the Satan red room, and where she has these nightmares, right? And she's beaten and all this terrible stuff. And then later on, when she moves to Thornfield Hall, she's put in her quarters, and she hears voices of, like, she thinks she hears the ghost of a woman, like, talking to her in her sleep. And then she thinks she sees a ghost, like, wandering the halls. Well, it turns out she's not insane, right? She's not like, she's not like Bernadette in WIDE Sargasso Sea, because it actually is, what's her name? No, Antoinette, not Bernadette. It's Bertha, but they call her Bertha. But there is actually a madwoman that we find out, which is the big reveal in Jane Eyre, that he's keeping up there. And she asks questions about it. She's questioning, and she's, intelligent, and she basically, he comes to love her because, like, she has a mind and a soul, and she's her own person, right? And he he admires her strength and her inner beauty, which is one of the themes in the book, because she at one point tells him that, look, it's the inner qualities of a man that that a woman would fall in love with, right? And that's important because of what happens at the end of the book. But before we get to that, we find out after he falls in love with her and then he asks her to marry him, that they go to the ceremony and they're going to be married, and then all of a sudden this deuce juicer bursts in and says, "No, they can't be married. He's already married." And it turns out that he is already married. And then of course the preacher's up there. The minister is holding the big book, and he's got the ring on it, and the ring drops to the ground. Bad omen. We also see, by the way, one of the omens that occurs throughout marriage in the Victorian novels is the crowing of the cock. And this is obviously allegorical and refers to the cock crowing, right? And before the cock crows 3 times, so you will betray me. And the betrayal is sort of transposed in these books to a betrayal between 2 partners, or a betrayal of love, or a betrayal of self. But he drops the ring to the ground, so their marriage is now sullied by the dirt of the ground, just like he is reaching down in terms of his social strata to marry her. But now it's sort of inverted, because he takes them back to Thornfield Hall and he says, "You want to see what happened to my wife?" He goes up into the attic room, and they walk in, and there is an absolutely mad woman up there. The mad woman is up there and has been locked in. And when Jane Eyre was asking questions about her, what's up with this? Is there someone up there? And they're like, "Oh, she's a servant. Her name is Mrs. Poole." Right? Oh, no, Mrs. Poole is the guardian, right? She's taking care of a servant who chooses to be up there, and sometimes she drinks a little bit and wanders the house. But then she sees, nope, that was all a lie. And Rochester didn't lie to her. Because one thing about these Byronic heroes also is that Rochester and Heathcliff, for all of their faults, they don't lie, right? They are true even in their evil, if that makes sense. Which is an interesting variation on the Miltonian Satan character, who is the father of lies, right? And so they see this mad woman, and Rochester says, "Look, man, I brought her back here, and she was insane," and that story that I already told, and, I've been taking care of her up here, but she's insane, and she's a pyro, and she's an arsonist, and wants to burn me in my bed. Now, WIDE SARGASSO SEA explained why she was obsessed with fire, and in fact, one of the things, another motif in these books is the bookend. The books themselves are bookended by either the monolithic twin pillars in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or the twin pillars of the figures on the hill, or the black flag, or the stones. And in WIDE SARGASSO SEA, they are twin pillars of fire, but they are inverted. They're not the pillars of fire from the Old Testament. They are pillars of fire representing the hellish interior of the characters and their intentions, right? Because the book begins with the fire at the house, and it also ends with fire, because she set fire to the house. And in Jane Eyre, the book ends with after Jane Eyre is put off by the fact that her fiance has lied to her about Bertha, or what's her name, Antoinette, in the attic, and how he was already married. I mean, even the minister says, "Man, you're about to be a bigamist," even though it's clearly a reason for divorce, right, or dissolution, that this woman is totally insane. But anyway, so she leaves, and she goes to be a governess somewhere else, and she finds out the people she's a governess with to take her in. She's been wandering in the wasteland, and they take her in, and they're loving. And it turns out that that's one of the guys is her relative. She finds out she's come into a fortune. Then she is the psychic connection that I mentioned earlier. Is she thinks she hears her name being called by Rochester, and it's sort of a ghostly. It's this ghostly, otherworldly calling to her, just like the wandering ghost of Catherine and Heathcliff breaks through shatters the window, and tries to break back into his life, because he says, haunt me. But it turns out she goes back to Thornfield Hall, and the house is in ruins, desolation, and cinders, and that Rochester has lost his hand and his vision. Symbolism, right? I don't know if it's his left hand. I don't know if his left hand has been burned off. It would be interesting if it were. I don't remember that detail, but his hand has been burned off. Anakin Skywalker style, where it's cut off by a lightsaber. Shouts out to Jeff. And he's also lost his vision, which is the wasteland idea of the Sophoclean Tiresias, right? Who can see the future but cannot see the present. And she says, and he says, I'm hideous, don't look at me, right? And she says, no, you're beautiful now, because now you're humbled, and now you have to rely on your inner strength. And then she decides to marry him. Then she gets pregnant, they have a child, and they live, right? But it's interesting that book also ends with flames, but then is superseded or transcended by the unification in the marriage. I mean, it's really a true Shakespearean comedy in a sense, right? Because all of the tragedy that occurs results in unification, and it's like a thin line between what could happen in the tragedy and the comedy. So anyway, so a couple of things about Jane Eyre. One passage, I mean, again, Charlotte Bronte is brilliant, and chapter 28, page 302 of this book, on nature, I wrote, this is a Wordsworthian passage: solitude, speaker released from society of her own accord, no binding ties, able to wander lonely as a cloud. It's interesting, she's wandering, but she's not tethered like Tess is. And it says, a North Midland shire, dusk with moorland, ridged with mountains, this I see. There are great moors behind and on each hand of me. There are waves of mountains far beyond the deep valley at my feet. The deep valley at her feet, right, is the valley of the shadow of death, which she is rising above here. Not a tie holds me to human society at this moment. Not a charm or hope calls me where my fellow creatures are. None that saw me would have a kind thought or a good wish for me. I have no relative but the universal mother nature. I will seek her breast and ask repose. Well, that's interesting, because that is obviously a pagan, a transcendentalist 19th century, but pagan way of looking at her ultimate freedom, right? It says, I struck straight into the heath. I held onto a hollow. I wrote over it again. Rowing the brown moorside, I waded knee-deep in its dark growth. I turned with its turnings, and finding a moss-blackened granite crag in a hidden angle, I sat down under it. High banks of moor were about me. The crag protected my head. The sky was over that. That's truly Byronic symbolism. And remember, Satan lying in, like, he's lying down in Paradise Lost. Remember, Milton describes Satan lying down with the adamantine chains in the crags. Some time passed before I felt tranquil even here. I had a vague dread that wild cattle might be near, or that some sportsman or poacher might discover me. If a gust of wind swept the waste, I looked up, fearing that it was the rush of a bull. If a plover whistled, I imagined it a man. Finding my apprehensions unfounded, however, and calmed by the deep silence that reigned as evening declined at nightfall, I took confidence. As yet, I had not thought. I had only listened, watched, dreaded. Now I regained the faculty of reflection. So she's wandering. The faculty of reflection is interesting because that ties into the mirror images that occur throughout Wide Sargasso Sea, and also in Wuthering Heights, and in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. All these books, one of the central symbols is of the looking glass, the mirror, right, where the character will look into the mirror to see themselves. In Wuthering Heights, it's interesting because the characters will look into the window, and the window is obviously both reflective of their psyche, but also of the future, right, of the outside world, or of the exterior beyond their interior life. In Wuthering Heights, that mirror is shattered. In Wide Sargasso Sea, and I guess in Jane Eyre, it's burned. In Tess, the character never truly reflects upon herself in those instances. And in Jane Eyre, she gains her sense of self-reflection through looking at nature. On pages 339 and 340, I just thought I would highlight this passage because it highlights the perfect beauty of Olive, and it's the euphony and the symphonic description is pretty amazing. It was true, though Mr. Rivers had started at the first of those musical accents, as if a thunderbolt split a cloud over his head. He stood yet at the close of the sentence in the same attitude in which the speaker had surprised him, his arm resting on the gate, his face directed toward the west. He turned at last with measured deliberation. A vision, as it seemed to me, had risen at his side. There appeared within 3 feet of him a form clad in pure white, a youthful, graceful form, full yet fine in contour. And when, after bending to caress Carlo, it lifted up its head and threw back a long veil, there bloomed under his glance a face of perfect beauty. Perfect beauty is a strong expression, but I do not retrace or qualify it. As sweet features as even the temperate clime of Albion molded, as pure hues of rose and lily as ever her humid gales and vapory skies generated and screened justified in this instance the term. No charm was wanting, no defect was perceptible. The young girl had regular and delicate lineaments, eyes shaped and colored as we see them in lovely pictures, large and dark and full. The long and shadowy eyelash which encircles a fine eye was so soft of fascination. The penciled brow, which gives such clearness, the white, smooth forehead, which adds such repose to the livelier beauties of tint and ray, the cheek oval, fresh and smooth, the lips fresh, too, ruddy, healthy, sweetly formed, the even and gleaming teeth without flaw, the small dimpled chin, the ornament of rich, plenteous tresses, all advantages, in short, which combined realized the ideal of beauty were fully hers. I wondered as I looked at this fair creature. I admired her with my whole heart. Nature had surely formed her in a partial mood, and forgetting her usual stinted stepmother dole of gifts, had endowed this, her darling, with a grandame's bounty. Pretty amazing. I mean, the language, again, is so euphonious and symphonic. Let's see. We also get, another thing is the constant mention of charm, right? Despair thee of thy charm. Let the angel of mercy tell thee, right? I bet a charmed life. The idea of the charm, of the occultic charm, or living in these instances, it's almost like a charmed life. Like they're walking through nature searching for a charm, right? Or they're charmed by these satyr scenes that occur throughout these books and looking for something meaningful. Anyway, and then one more instance, page 396, another thing I highlighted, the portal yawned void, which is Shakespearean, right? The Shakespearean idea of the yawning gulf or the yawning void or the void agape, which is the hole in the earth, right? Straight to hell. I think it was Thomas Hardy who talked about, who mentioned that the most negative image one could imagine was a woman giving birth straight into the grave, right? Which, again, shows Hardy's. I mean, I always avoid Hardy. I think it's important that we read these works. But that certainly is an idea of, I mean, he mentions Huxley. He also mentioned Huxley in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I thought that was interesting. He talks about First Cause and Huxley, and the fact that, that Harold Bloom basically says that Thomas Hardy is, even for all of Hardy's anti-Victorian, not rhetoric, but his criticisms of Victorian England, he is critical in a number of ways in which he seems to be furthering the worst of the ideals, if that makes sense. It is pretty grim, Maddie. I obviously liked the Brontes a lot more, and I think that, again, we're going to get to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights later on, maybe this week. And, of course, we're going to get to Dracula, and we're going to cover Dracula on birthday night, and, of course, Bram Stoker's wonderful film, 1992 film, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a faithful version of the book. One thing that's interesting, I won't say too much about it because we're going to do a whole stream on it, but one thing interesting about Dracula, especially the book, it's kind of like Frankenstein. Go back to our Frankenstein stream. Remember that? I thought that was a pretty good stream that we did, because it is not what you remember. If you've read Dracula, if you've read it, then you may have to think about reimagining some of your interpretation of the book. For one thing, Dracula is a character who himself shows up very rarely in the book. He's not in it that much. And in a way, he is a Kurtzian figure in that sense. But I think that's one of the interesting things. Of course, that plays along with the theme and the overriding currents of the book, which is the shadowy figures of the elite psychic vampires sucking on the souls of the innocent. And but Dracula and vampire and the vampire novel. Another interesting thing, you guys, is that people forget that the major Hollywood, the major Hollywood thing whose place was taken by the superhero genre was the vampire genre. Remember how huge that was in the 2000s? Everything was vampires. I mean, we had Twilight, True Blood, all of these vampires were everywhere. And I think that probably says, not probably, that says something about, especially in terms of culture creation and revelation of the method. But it's interesting that was overtaken by the, this sort of apotheosis of this, superhero film genre, which has, completely saturated all elements of film, Hollywood, and culture, right? So that's about all I got, y'all. I hope you found that interesting. Again, I did this. I didn't just do it for you. I did it for me. But I've been living with these books for the past few days, and I will be. I enjoyed them, and it's not my first rodeo. Yes, Anne Rice was huge. The Anne Rice book that I always think of is the book Violin, and I think of it just because I remember seeing the cover of the book as a little kid, because the cover of the book, the first edition, the hardback, was of the martyrdom of is it Saint Sebastian, who was with the arrows. It's called Violin, and it's shot through with arrows. That's what really I thought about Anne Rice. That's what I knew of Anne Rice when I was younger. And then, of course, Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt's love scene in Interview with the Vampire. And I remember that movie because of Kirsten Dunst winning Best Kiss, which is, you look back at that and you go, what? Because of what occurred in the movie. Kirsten Dunst, my age, or a little younger. And remember Antonio Banderas. There's a scene with Antonio Banderas in that film that's pretty frightening. It's way more frightening than the scenes with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. And of course, it's got Christian Slater in it. But yeah, we'll be going over Only Lovers Left Alive, which that's a good movie because it's Jim Jarmusch. It's a an arty movie where it's interesting because the desolation and ruin of the modern era comes to a head with Detroit, especially when it was filmed and where it was filmed. And that's sort of compared to the almost occidental scenery of Tangier, where his lover lives, and then they are reunited. We also get the Louisiana voodoo, which obviously comes from mainly from, that's a thing in reality. And that plays a part in Wide Sargasso Sea because Louisiana is kind of seen as as the American port that is the entranceway to the New World from the Caribbean and the Windward and Leeward Isles that occurs in Wide Sargasso Sea, where the kind of psychic vampire character of Rochester turns into a literal vampire, right? So anyway, that's about all I got, y'all. Thank you for being here with me. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for your support again. And if you want to super chat me, you can do that at any time, and I will definitely give you a shout out. Let's see, and thank you again to Alan for that $5, that $5 donation. And I hope y'all have a wonderful week. This is going to be it's a good month. We're going into fall, and it's going to be good, y'all. So thanks again. I appreciate y'all. That's all I got. Peace.